Welcome to The Free Will Show, a podcast that provides a beginner-friendly introduction to free will while also exploring cutting-edge developments on the topic. I'm Taylor Sear.
And I'm Matt Flummer. In this episode, we talk with Wayne Wu about his work on automaticity, attention, and memory in the philosophy of action.
Thanks for listening. I'm happy to introduce Wayne Wu, professor in the Department of History and Philosophy of Science and a member of the Center for the Neural Basis of Cognition at the University of Pittsburgh. Wayne is interested in exploring the nature of human agency as a biological phenomenon. He brings his background in biology to bear on his philosophical work. He's written extensively on attention, including in his recent book, Movements of the Mind, a theory of attention, intention, and action, published by Oxford University Press in 2023. And in that book, Wayne draws a connection between intention and memory, and we've asked him to join us to talk about that with us today. So welcome to the show, Wayne. Could you start by telling us a bit about yourself, your work, and how you came to be interested in working on issues related to agency and the philosophy of action?
Yeah. Well, thanks for having me.
Of course.
Yeah, so I think you covered it in that intro, so thanks very much. Yeah, I've written a bit on mind and agency, and I think, as you mentioned, I bring this kind of biological aspect to it, in part because when I was an undergraduate, I kind of developed this perspective in a way by accident. I was taking a course in genetics and at the same time a course in organic chemistry. I was kind of an organic or chemistry nerd in high school, and I don't know about you too, but biology was always like dissection of things that you didn't want to be in the same room. And I thought, like, who wants to do biology, right? Then I was in this genetics course, maybe because I thought about being a pre-med or something. So I took a genetics course, and then you learn about DNA, but not just as the genetic material, but as this macro organic molecule. And it does interesting stuff. It replicates, it recombines, and then there's that control of expression that depends on it. And taking organic chemistry, it occurred to me, like it occurred to lots of people, that you could understand like a higher level life biological processes with lower chemical principles that seemed much more intuitive to me. And this idea that you could explain something really interesting by something more basic just really captured my attention. And so I spent my undergraduate year studying both biology and chemistry and started a PhD at Berkeley, doing molecular and cell biology. And the sort of mantra then, maybe still now, structure function, how to structure determine function. And so I was really interested in understanding the molecular control of gene expression. I guess if you follow like Maria Alvarez and John Hyman's work, it's like that's a kind of agency, right?
Right.
So that was what I was interested in then. It was just not a good thing that I hated lab work. I didn't want to be in the lab. And so just like 2 years of toiling unhappily, I finally decided, I got to make a change. I dropped out. And if you've been to Berkeley, it's really a great place to wander around and figure out what to do with your life. And I happened to take a class, just sat in on a class with Bruce Vermazen. He was a faculty member at the time in philosophy. I'm pretty sure he was one of Donald Davidson's PhD students.
Okay.
And he taught this class in philosophy of action. The first half was Donald Davidson's work, and then the second half was Michael Brotman's work on intention. I don't know. Something about it just pulled me in. Maybe because it's also about agents who have control capacities, and it just seemed like a somewhat natural extension to jump up from molecular control to agentive control. So ultimately, I after some years, is a little bit of wandering, I came back to Berkeley to do a PhD with John Searle and Jay Wallace, who both work on action mind. And that's what I've been working on since.
Yeah, very cool.
Awesome.
You emphasize the role of attention and action. So could you say a bit about why this is important not to set aside and how attention plays a role in action?
Yeah. So I wonder, it might be useful to put that in the context of what I call a selection problem. And so the idea of a selection problem is something that I do in the book to argue for a certain psychological structure of agency. And so I think having that in view makes it easier to see where attention comes in. So I think when we think about attention, just to kind of have people have a little bit of a foothold, James has this really nice quotation, which normally I remember, but being a little bit nervous now, I don't remember the exact words. But it's something like, when you attend to something, your mind selects one thing among many in order to deal with. And there's a little bit about consciousness that I'll set aside. It's in order to deal with, and then you withdraw from everything else. Like I think if you think about your own kind of experiences of attention, that description should sound right. Or at least I hope it sounds right. I mean, he was trying to give voice to the folk conception at that point.
Right.
Yeah.
So, like having that in mind, and then now consider a selection problem. And so the one I think I like, just because people might know the story, is a fable that's attributed to Jean Buridan, who actually I've never read. He's a French philosopher. It's Buridan's Donkey.
Yes.
I think there are older antecedents in it, maybe in Islamic philosophy as well as in Aristotle, but we credit it to Buridan. I know you two know the story, but just a brief reminder, this donkey, a hungry donkey, walks up to two bales of hay. And unfortunately for the donkey, it walks like right down the middle. And so the two bales of hay are the same, basically. They look the same. They're the same size. They're equidistant from the donkey. It's just that one's on the left and one's on the right. And so now the donkey's hungry. And I think part of the point of the story is that given that there's no qualitative difference between the two bales of hay, there's no basis for a kind of rational choice, a way of favoring one over the other. Mm-hmm. And as you know, typical philosophical stories where there's death involved, the donkey can't make a choice, it starves to death. Right? Okay. So that gives us a kind of 2x1 selection problem. So there are many different kinds of selection problems in terms of structure, but this is a 2x1. What do I mean by 2x1? There are two things a donkey sees, two targets of potential targets for action. So we can start by identifying two visual experiences just from the theorist's perspective, seeing the left bale and the right bale. And so those are the inputs to the selection problem. And then the output to the selection problem is a movement towards one of the bales of hay. Mm-hmm. And so the 2x1 aspect of it identifies two possible actions. And so now here's the problem for the donkey as a selection problem. We can pose it as a question. Donkey asks itself, what should I do? What is to be done? And the answer would be one, a decision, or an action. Right? So the selection problem in this case is two potential actions. If the donkey doesn't solve the problem, it starves to death, as in the story. So the selection problem sort of identifies a structure for action there. The input, which is always a psychological state, and output, which is a movement, bodily movement, but it could also be a movement of mind. So those two elements are the ground floor, if you like, of action. We just need a third element, which is what the donkey lacks, and what I call generally a bias. And a bias here is something like an intention, but it can be lots of other things. So an intention would be just like, I've got to eat something, so let me eat the one on the right. And that bias there is, in a sense, allowing the donkey to solve the selection problem because it's going to prioritize one of the actions over the other. So you end up having this three-part structure for actions, biases, intentions being a very salient type, which pushes the selection problem. In the 2x1 case, it resolves it to one action that the donkey should perform, namely the one that it decides to act on. And then the donkey acts. And in the happy story, which we'll go with because you need some happiness in the world, it survives. It acts. All right, so man, now that was a sort of circuitous way to come back to James's idea. So James's idea again was when you attend to something, your mind selects a target to deal with. Mm-hmm. Now, I want to point out that isn't just the folk, because if you look at the science of attention, you'll also see that to study attention, scientists have to have subjects perform tasks in the laboratory. Mm-hmm. And those tasks also have that structure. The subject selects something to respond to in a way that the experimenter can measure. So it could be looking for something, detecting something, tracking something. Right. All right, so that idea, selecting something to deal with, you go back to the structure of action. And it's almost like modus ponens, right? If the animal's selecting, well, actually that's what the donkey does in the happy story. The donkey visually selects one bale, withdraws from the other in order to deal with it, eat it to survive. So Matt, then I think the central role of attention then is that it's always built into every action. Because every action, if you'll grant me this, I mean, there's an argument for this, but I think in lots of actions that we're familiar with, they instantiate this selection problem structure.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you act, you're always attending.
That's really cool. Well, when I think about intentional action, I think about having a certain sort of control over my action, or maybe guiding it. But you point out that intentional action is characterized by automaticity as well as control. Could you briefly explain the role that automaticity plays in action?
Yeah. I do want to make a plug for automaticity. I think it's
Mhm.
just one of these really cool aspects of action that, in some ways, philosophy of action hasn't theorized as much about directly. I mean, there are elements of it, obviously. Um, but I think if you want to understand skilled behavior, virtuous behavior, lots of forms of spontaneous thinking like mind wandering, daydreaming, creative thoughts, solving problems. I think implicit bias as well is driven by automatic aspects of action. Um, so I think to understand automaticity and agency, it's important to think about it as really just the opposite of control. Like they're sort of opposing in some way. So when we think about intentional action, we are interested in control. It's just like the agent's ability to exert him or herself onto the world. Um, one idea I think just to keep in mind, and I'm going to have like three big ideas here, but like one idea to keep in mind is that control is paradigmatically expressed by us as agents in our intentional actions.
Mm-hmm.
And the way that I want to think about that is to connect control analytically to the notion of an intention. And so here's like the first idea
Mm-hmm.
that you might call like a control thesis or something like that. Intentional actions are the agent's expression of control. Why? Because that action is produced precisely because the agent intends to act on it. Right? That's the sort of channel by which we express our control. There's a second idea now that now brings in automaticity, and you can find it in psychology, but I think there's something intuitive about it, which is again that thing that I mentioned before, that control and automaticity are sort of inconsistent with each other.
Mm-hmm.
And so some people some listeners and you would know Daniel Kahneman's work, Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow. And so psychologists talk about control processes, automatic processes, system one, system two, people who know that literature, type one, type two. So that's a kind of like division, right? There are control processes on one side, automatic processes on the other. So that's a second idea. And that's fine. These two ideas go together until you notice that in a lot of intentional actions, there's a ton of automaticity. So here's like a simple example. You're at a party, you decide to have a glass of wine. You'll be there long enough and you'll be able to drive home. It's not a big deal. One glass of wine.
Mm-hmm.
And so you intentionally reach for a glass of wine. So that's an expression of your control according to that first idea. But that reach is the reach that it is because of, for example, the speed by which you reach for it.
Mm-hmm.
Right? The force that you apply to a dainty wine glass versus a dumbbell, right? You scale that. The grip, contours of your grip that are sensitively shaped according to the shape of the glass. Mm-hmm. You don't think about doing all that. It just happens automatically, you might say. And so that seems to me a pervasive aspect of action. But if you put these three ideas together, they fall apart, right? Because remember, control is part of intentional action. Automacy and control work against each other. They can't both be instantiated. But your intentional actions are also automatic. So this is a tension that I think is, in the end, only apparent. And here's the resolution. We have to think about control and automaticity, not as just the processes themselves, but really features of the process. And what this buys you is that a single action can be both controlled and automatic relative to various features. It's just that any given feature can't be both.
Okay, right.
Okay, so you can resolve the tension by just having all three and just noting that what we should think about are the properties of action and think about them as either automatic or controlled. So in my reaching for the wine glass, what's controlled is the fact that reaching is a reaching for a wine glass. That's what I intend. Right? But everything else that I mentioned, the kinematics, the force, all of that is automatic. And that's a good thing because The point is that you don't have to think about or plan for everything in action.
Right.
Yeah.
Um, so I think that's the idea of automaticity. It's pervasive in action. It gives us a way of thinking about all these interesting kinds of action, and the way to understand it is to understand it as, in a way, conflicting with control, but at the same time consistent with it.
Yeah.
Hmm.
I before I haven't really thought about automaticity in terms of simple actions like grabbing a glass. I've always thought about it in more complex actions like driving or
Yeah.
performing a golf swing or some
Oh,
complex action where there's so much going on that it has to be more automatic or you have too much to pay attention to.
I think that's exactly right. I actually think like skilled cases are a really nice way of getting into it. And one way of getting into it is thinking about like learning the golf swing or learning to play the violin or learning to drive. I remember when I was 15 driving for the first time, in the parking lot, and it was like I was like looking at all
Mhm.
these controls, and
Right.
my dad was telling me like, well, this is how you do it, and so in my intention, I'm trying to remember all the instructions, right? And so that first set of driving, it's like trying to keep track of all of that. That's like controlled. But as I get better at driving, or any of these other skill cases you mentioned, Matt, I start to offload that precisely because it becomes automatic. And
Mhm.
so my intention, my thinking about the action doesn't have to encode all these fine things, right? They drop out of what I have to think about because they become automatic. And that also frees me, let's say in the sports cases or in the artistic cases, for expanded control because I can think
Mhm.
about other things like how to, weave through the defense or how to play this more in a more aesthetically pleasing way or something like that.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Mhm.
So I think, yes, if you really want to understand skill, I think this kind of transition between control and automaticity is precisely how to get deeper into it.
Yeah.
Well, with that framework in mind, let's turn now to intention and memory. We've already talked about how intentional action is characterized by control and automaticity, but what exactly is an intention on your view?
Yeah, I was getting nervous about that one. So on the one hand, I have a kind of traditional view. So an intention is a psychological attitude. Its content is that it represent an action as to be done.
Hmm.
So in that framework, you might start thinking about like plans and future directed intentions. But it also has a functional role, which is that it's supposed to bring about the action, an instance of the action kind that it's representing. And so that's a fundamental role, but it also has a role in reasoning. Brotman, I think, is an important aspect of his view. So you arrive at an intention when you reason about what to do and you make a decision. Right? That's something we hope the donkey does. And also, your intentions can also feed in to more reasoning, right? It can be a basis for further reasoning. Um, and so, in that, if you remember the sort of structure of action, it's got a bias, an input, and output.
Right.
Intentions, typically, the way I think about it, they're a bias, right? They help you solve these selection problems when you make a decision. But when they play a role in reasoning, they can also be a kind of input. And one thing I would just note about that, again, go back to that William James's idea, or our idea really, of attention.
Hmm.
When intention or any cognitive state functions as an input to, let's say, reasoning, that's the input output part of the structure. That means that intention would be a basis of attention in that case. You would be attending to what you're doing as you'd say decide further aspects of the plan. So there's a kind of duality in terms of the functional role of intention. So maybe that's the start of a twist in the way
Right.
that I think about intention from the traditional view, precisely because the structure helps me think about it. The twist, I think, is, and here I just want to emphasize that now I'm thinking about what my advisor, John Searle, called intentions in action.
Mhm.
Intentions as you're doing the action as you intend. Intention is a kind of memory. And so I've been playing with terminology for this. Sometimes I call it a practical memory. Sometimes I call it memory for work or for action. And that's something that I think hasn't maybe been considered as much in some of the debates on the nature of intention. But I think it's a really important part of intention. So that's like the additional twist that I would add.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting because it seems like it does at least require memory because some intentional actions are extended over time and
That's right.
you got to keep track of what you're doing.
Yeah, actually, exactly. I would say that's exactly right, Matt. That is that I think to think about temporally extended agency that's coherent to the agent, we'd have to we have to I think about it intention having a kind of memory role.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Um,
In what sense is an agent being active on your view when they're intending to act or are acting in a particular way? And how is that related to memory?
Yeah. So, well, actually, going back to the point about temporally extended agency. So, I hope you both have had this experience, and other people listening have had this experience. So, so I hope this is a familiar case. So, call this idea like, or this argument, something like the argument from amnesia. And so, the case is when you go into a room and you suddenly forget what you were in the room for.
Totally. Happens more often the older I get.
You've had this experience too, not just me, right? So what happens? Like
Last night, I was making dinner, and my son came into the kitchen. He's 7, and he was like, "Dad, Dad, Dad!" And I got my attention, and then said, "Oh, I forgot what I came in here for. I forgot what I wanted to say."
I actually think this is a phenomenon. I meant to look it up earlier. I think that actually there's a term for this phenomenon, but it's funny. It's like the threshold is almost like an erasing machine or amnesia machine. Yeah. Like you cross the threshold, and all of a sudden, like what? Yeah. So it's a kind of forgetting, and but it's a forgetting of what it is you're there to do. So you might call it a kind of practical forgetting. And so here's an interpretation of the case that I think I find plausible. I'll see what you two think about it. So one idea would be like, there's intention, but intention is not a memory. So then now we have to explain this case. You have to say something like, well, you had a memory as well about what it is you were going to do, and you lost that memory. The threshold erased it for some reason. But I don't think that's quite right. It's not like there were two things, a memory and an intention. And as you cross the threshold, the memory gets erased, but you still have your intention. Because if you still had your intention, you could tell me what you are planning to do. That's the point of intention, right? It allows us, for example, to joint plan. And so the intention then, is it really a kind of like backup buffer for this other memory that gets erased? I think a simpler view is that precisely what you lose track of when you cross the threshold is that intention. The intention is your memory of what it is that you're there to do. Take it as a hypothesis if you find that a bit too controversial. We don't have distinct things there. The intention is precisely a kind of memory. It's keeping track of what we're doing. You had asked about the activity, but that's maybe that controversial thesis. I don't know. Maybe you're want to push back.
I'm thinking of another case though that is maybe related and in an intentional action that you completed, but you didn't remember performing, like when you drive. I don't know if you've ever had this experience. Yeah, where I start to daydream while I'm driving, and all of a sudden I'm home, and I don't remember driving home.
Right. So I suppose I'd ask a little bit more about that. Is it that you don't remember some of the details of driving home, or you don't end up in your driver or wherever it is and sort of think like, "Whoa, what am I doing here?" Right? Right. You might think like, "Oh, I don't remember driving by the store or the corner store that I always have to pass, but because I was focused on something else." But so you might forget details. That vary depending on what you do. Maybe we can talk a little bit later about this when we talk about like fine tuning what you pick up. But I wonder, Matt. But it's not like you completely forget the kind of action that you're planning, namely driving home. Like when you pull in, you know that you've completed that, but you might be kind of like, oh wow, that went by really fast. Normally I notice this or something like that. Yeah, I don't know. I hope people kind of play with that idea. This idea of that intentions are fundamentally, mnemonic. But maybe I can speak to the issue about the activity, Matt, that you had put forward in the question. So one reason why, um, so I, what I want to say is that intention is not merely static. So in philosophy, we sometimes talk about mental states and intentions, beliefs, desires. We often speak in those terms. And Davidson, as you both know, was worried that that isn't going to be the thing that moves one to action. It has to be something more current.
Mm-hmm.
And then he switched in certain ways. So I don't think intention is static, at least intention and action, and maybe proximate intention. But when I say that, I also don't want people to think, oh, wait, that can't be right, because let me think of a kind of active memory, because that's what I'm committed to if intention is memory, both memory and active. So here's an example of a kind of active memory I think we're all familiar with, maybe less so now in the modern age or our age. Remembering a phone number. Like someone tells you a phone number, and you have to keep it in mind, remember it. And the natural thing to do if you can't talk out loud is to repeat it in your head, right? Inner speech. So that's one kind of active remembering. And this is the kind of remembering that the psychologists theorize as working memory. That's really, if you like, phenomenally in the front, like foregrounded. It's very experiential. That's not what I have in mind when I talk about activity and intention. So here's another type of activity and intention, our conversation right now. So as we were talking earlier in our exchanges, when I respond or you respond, you have to remember what the other person just said.
Right.
You could run an argument for amnesia there, where right before you talk, I zap out that memory. And again, it's going to be like walking in the room. You're going to stop and say, like, what am I doing here?
Mm-hmm.
So I think even in conversation and the back and forth of conversation, there has to be a kind of active memory. It's not like long-term memory of like, hey, Taylor, Matt, what did you have as your last birthday cake, right? And now you've got to like make an effort to remember that and do some tricks to figure it out. In conversation, you are keeping track by remembering what the person just said, at the very least. That activity doesn't require, for example, that you repeat those words as you do the phone number.
Right.
So I want to note that this is a different kind of mental mnemonic activity necessary for temporally extended action in the conversation, but very phenomenally distinct from saying the numbers in your head.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the kind of activity that I think if we start looking for it, we can find it's, if you like, in the background, although I don't like that metaphor, but it's kind of in the background in the way that inner speech is not in the background.
Right.
And you've got to hold for temporal extended agency the plan, what you intend in this kind of active way, at least for during action and maybe right before action.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, we've been asking about intention and memory, but now I want to ask about intending with an ing on
Yeah.
the end,
Yes.
which you describe as a simultaneous action of practical reasoning as the agent acts.
Yeah.
Could you tell us a little bit about that part of your framework?
Yeah. So maybe as a preamble, um, I've been talking about intention as memory, and Taylor's you're sort of pushing like there's a kind of extension of this. So let me give the controversial thesis. um, as you act, you are intending to act. That's the intention in action. It's active, and not just active, but it's actually an acting, a doing. So there's the action of intending.
Mm-hmm.
And here I think language isn't great because the way that we've been talking about intention in the past, I don't know, half century or so, I'm not sure that intending already sounds kind of funny, but if someone says like, oh yeah, that's also an action, I think that would strike individuals as a bit odd.
Right.
So the connection to memory at least softens the blow of the oddness because remembering is something that you might be okay with as an action.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think when we think about intention as memory, then we can think of intending as remembering. And I think remembering is something that we often allow to be actional or a type of action. There's a background here where I came to all of this in part because I just happened to be reading this book, Plans and the Structure of Behavior. It was written in the 1960s by Miller, Pribram, and Galanter. Probably the person that people might know is George Miller. He wrote this paper. The title was something like The Magic 7 plus or minus or something like that. Magical number 7, about memory and the capacity for memory. If you might be, if you haven't read this book, it's interesting. If you read the book, it just sounds very Brotmanian. There's a lot of Brotman in the book.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, plans and the structure of behavior might make you think about this as well.
Right.
So they note at one point that this point about memory, for temporally extended agency, you have to remember your plan. But they're psychologists. And so now they're thinking memory, like, well, no, it's not the kinds of memory that psychology has been talking about up to then. We need to give it a new label. Let's call it working memory. And this is where the term, I think, was introduced into English language psychology. And it's interesting, right? Because because normally if you think about like the psychology of working memory, you think about like, remembering phone numbers, you think about slots, putting things into slots, how big is the buffer in working memory? Mm-hmm. They introduce it because they want something to store plans over time. And that the plans that are not executed, they actually explicitly call that an intention.
Oh, okay.
And this was kind of life-changing for me intellectually, because I always thought, like, who cares about working memory? It's episodic memory. That's what's cool philosophically. But now we have these psychologists who are building a bridge for us, just to go back to these themes earlier when I talked about like this integration of different approaches. They're building a bridge for us between working memory, for which there are now tens of thousands of papers in psychology, and intention. And the thing about working memory from the psychological empirical perspective, it's an active kind of memory. And if you look at what the brain does while it's maintaining something in working memory, the brain is working. It's generating signals to hold that. Mm-hmm. So that perspective just shifted me from thinking about intentions as static to intentions as a kind of action. And what the action is in a sense, holding the planned in mind over time, or remembering. Mm-hmm. Now, that might strike you both or other people as odd. I expect it to. Here's one way that it might be odd, aside from the linguistic aspects, like we don't really talk about intentions that way. Another reason you might think it's odd is that I'm committed then to the following claim, that when you act intentionally, there's a second action going on. You're remembering. And this might seem odd because doing two things at once is not that easy, right? Or to go back to our skilled cases, like you're in a performance playing the violin, or I used to play the piano, and I remember when I was a kid, I was in a recital. And the moment I started thinking about my playing, that's when you start choking. Horrible things happen, right? And so there are cases that we all have experienced where you're doing something intentionally and you're thinking at the same time, and that just blows everything up. Mm-hmm. So you might wonder, like, well, how can this be, right? How can it, when you act intentionally, you're also thinking about your action? Right. So I want to point out, though, that this thinking, this intending, this remembering is different. The choking case, like when I was a kid, that was intentionally thinking about what I was doing. Mm-hmm. But remembering as an action is fully automatic. I don't intend on the same time to intend. I just intend. Mm. So in the structure of action, what I've got is I've got my intention, and the content, the plan that it holds, is extending across time as I hold it in my memory, as I'm remembering it. That's the sort of structure of the action, but it's automatic. It's a way for me to think or attend to my action in my intention. Mm-hmm. All right, that's the basic picture that I would recognize might be controversial, but I hope some of the things that I said kind of soften the blows of the controversy that make it at least slightly plausible or worth considering.
Right. Yeah, that makes it, the case that you described where you're trying to do two things at once, it seems like it's when you're trying to do two things intentionally at the same time that things fall apart.
That's right. That's right.
But if one is automatic, maybe there's not as much tension there.
Yeah, right. So go back to our driving case, right? You can carry a conversation while you're driving. Mm-hmm. And in a sense, you're doing both intentionally. But part of it is because so much of driving has become automatized. Right. Or it doesn't demand the same kind of cognitive resources. Go back to the first time you drove on a highway. at high speeds. Probably then, if you were a conscientious and careful driver, you would say to your mom or dad, like, please don't talk to me right now. Right?
Yeah,
Or
right.
even now, you might have that, feeling,
Mhm.
right?
Right.
Precisely because you're not in a position in which automaticity allows you to offload some of your cognition.
Right.
But I think when it
Mhm.
becomes very automatic, then they both go together fine. And so that's actually a nice case of thinking about, what I mean by in remembering as you act is that remembering is fully automatic. And philosophically, we need that. The argument for amnesia says that, look, there's no coherent agency unless you are always remembering in some sense what you're doing. The
Hmm.
moment you forget, things fall apart. So there's some almost like necessity of that kind of layer of intending as you
Hmm.
act.
Nice.
Yeah. Here and in some earlier parts of our discussion, listeners might have thought about how your view may clash with their thinking about agency. And you
Yeah.
know that this might be because a biological perspective on these issues in philosophical psychology has been missing. So,
Yeah.
as we conclude, do you have any thoughts or on ways philosophers might benefit from taking a biological perspective more seriously?
Yeah. I mean, I do think, certainly in philosophy of mind, broadly construed, maybe, the past 40 years or so, there's been a slow movement towards what we might call empirically informed philosophy or empirically informed philosophy of mind. I don't
Hmm.
know if you two have a view about agency, whether or not there's been a similar, expansion of it. I do think that that's a good change. I worry sometimes that there's an attitude among some, although maybe this is sort of older philosophers, that when you do the science, you're just kind of doing textbooky stuff, and
Mhm.
you're doing more science means doing less philosophy.
Hmm.
Or the science is only there to confirm or disconfirm philosophical conclusions to the extent that it can.
Hmm.
And I think many other people believe that there's a different approach, which is that philosophy can help us think more expansively about science can help us think more expansively about the kinds of things that we're interested in as philosophers. So
Yeah.
for me, the biology, what biology gave me was a kind of mechanistic sense of the word, although that may sound too crude in the context that we're interested in when we talk about agency, but just how things fit together. So, like, I've been thinking about attention and memory and perception and action, and where we're interested in is like our agency, our memory, our intention. So how do these things fit together in living creatures like us? And I think that's one reason why the biology matters. I think the biology also matters because we also make claims about how things hang together, how things are causally or constitutively related. And I think it would be overly optimistic to think that we would fully understand those relations by ignoring psychology, cognitive science, which I'm including in biology writ large, right? Just anything that's studying living things.
Yeah.
So maybe I can just mention just really quickly two things that I think were just to be more concrete about this. This idea of intention as memory, like I said earlier, I mean, if I was a philosopher doing the things that I had grown up thinking about, intentions would be states. And then I'd have to figure out, like, well, how does a static thing do the thing that it does? And what the
Right.
connection to working memory allowed me to start thinking was that intention is both active and dynamic. I realize now that I didn't answer your question fully, Taylor, but we'll just have to live with that about the technical reasoning and intending, how you
Yeah.
update your intentions as things change in the world. But
Mhm.
anyway, the point is just that intentions are not static. They both have this active aspect and also this
Right.
dynamic aspect. The other thing that I'll just quickly mention is the donkey case again, right? If the donkey makes a decision, it's going to live. And if you think about what's going on there from the old perspective, like a Davidson perspective, where it's got to be events, events
Hmm.
cause other events. How does that fit in that case? Because so here's how that case goes for the donkey. The donkey is already perceiving the bales of hay. Perception is already happening. Seeing is already happening. It's that when the donkey makes a decision, that there is a change. The donkey now goes to attending, focusing on that one bale of hay to eat.
Hmm.
That change from just merely seeing to attending is processual. It's really hard to make sense of if you just wanted to force it into like, oh, an event causes another event. And so one way that I think one path that opens up from thinking about the biology is precisely getting into the dynamics. And I think if you follow that line through, and I'll just make a provocative claim here, some of this is in the books that you mentioned, but if you follow that claim through, here's a position that you might end up with. Intention and perception in the donkey case are not distinct states of mind in that case. There's a sense in which they merge, precisely because the intention has to get into the perception to shift it. Now, that's metaphorical.
Sure.
But the reason why that I think opens up this is precisely thinking through some of the biological aspects of these states that we're philosophically interested in. This is something like the cognitive penetration debates in cognitive science and philosophy, right? These states, just these phenomena, just are really integrated and intimately related. So I would invite people to the extent of, to explore it. It could be really fruitful. It opens up avenues of thought.
Yeah, that's a nice point. And we've talked to some scientists more earlier on in the history of this podcast, but almost always it's neuroscientists or maybe someone working in physics or psychology. But it's nice to hear more on thinking about things biologically from that perspective. There could be more of that in the agency and free will literature.
Yeah, well, I think you've had these conversations. I would be interested in how you experience it. There is a bit of a bridge building that you need just to get everyone on the same page.
Yeah.
Especially because a lot of the terms that we use, the concepts that we use, are kind of folk concepts that we make a bit more technical.
Right.
So there's already a kind of disconnect. So there's a lot of work about just like getting on the same page. But I think when you can do that, it's immensely fruitful.
Yeah, I agree. Cool. Well, thanks so much, Wayne. This has been a really fun conversation. Appreciate hearing about the work in your book and beyond. If listeners are interested, where can they go to find your work?
So there's my daughter built me a beautiful website, except that I'd have no idea how to update it. But it's so beautiful that it's worth a look. It's waynewu.net. And one thing that is still available in that website are a bunch of videos of lectures that I've given in various places. And so people like to see videos of stuff and find it an easier way to digest things. That's there. There's the book Movements of the Mind that you mentioned, where a lot of the stuff that we discussed is argued for in more detail. But it's written for philosophers. So I did try and make it more also accessible to scientists. And so that might give it a broader reach. The only other book I might mention is a book that I just finished. It's a textbook. So it's meant for undergraduates as well as graduate students on attention. That's published by Routledge in 2025. And so there are a lot of the themes that we also talked about, but with anchored on attention that you can find there. But people who are interested in attention and consciousness, the ethical aspects of attention, skilled aspects of attention and its role in like spontaneous thinking. A lot of that's discussed there as well.
Excellent. Thanks so much.
Yeah. Thanks again, Wayne.
Thank you.
In our next episode, we will focus on the issue of taking responsibility, and our guest will be Eleanor Mason, professor of philosophy at the University of California, Santa Barbara.
Free audio post-production by alphonic.com.